businesses today are trying to adopt and measure on how doing good while being good can be achieved and also sustained at the same time. Today is about environmental, social, and governance. In short, we call it ESG. In past, public sector and governments have been focusing on this on the social era and the adoption of this, but now corporates are taking responsibility and putting in their effort and investment to achieve it as well. So today we've got experts, and I'd like to briefly say hello to Mr. Arjun Goswani and Dr. Professor Güven. Mr. Arjun is joining us from India, Delhi, and Dr. Güven from Turkey. So firstly, I would like to invite Mr. Arjun Goswani, where he'll be presenting about ESG in policy consideration for improving performance across sustainability and social parameters in EV and textile industry. Mr. Arjun Goswani is Director of Public Policy in Cyril, Amarchand, Mangaldas, one of the top law firm in India and expanding globally as well. So, Mr. Arjun, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to CACCI for this opportunity to talk about a very exciting topic. And I thought what I'll do is I'll present in my 15 minutes in 5 parts, right? So we'll start with what we mean by ESG and what some key drivers of it are. Then I'll just briefly take us through a review that we've done of 6 jurisdictions, India, Australia, Bangladesh, Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam, and the state of ESG across those jurisdictions. Then we'll delve into the EV sector, the electric vehicle sector, and the textile sector, and conclude with some thoughts about CACCI's role in all of this. So let's start with what we mean by ESG. The 3 letters stand for environmental, social, and governance, and these 3 pillars broadly represent sustainability in practice. So if we were to look at this at a company level, the E or environmental pillar would be represented, for example, by company action in reducing emissions or improving its waste management practices. If we're thinking of the social or S pillar, we can refer to labor and employment practices, safety standards, issues like diversity in the workforce. Those represent some examples of the S pillar. And then if we're talking about the G pillar, we're really talking about stewardship policies. We're talking about corporate governance. How does the board and management operate? And how does it operate not just with regard to shareholders, but other stakeholders? Because part of the ESG thrust is a move from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. So that's a brief run through of what ESG is. Now, in terms of drivers, there are some really important global drivers that affect every country, every jurisdiction, every set of regulators, every business. And one of those, of course, is climate change. And we've just seen the COP27 meeting at Sharm el-Sheikh. I'll come back to that in a moment. But irrespective of what one concludes about Sharm el-Sheikh, the widespread and intensifying effects of climate change is a huge driver of ESG. The second one is what has been happening on social inclusion and labor standards, particularly post-COVID-19 and the adverse effects of that on inclusion, concerns on social stability and lack of social inclusiveness. So these are some of the major global drivers, but there are important domestic drivers as well. And those domestic drivers tend to be a mix of supply side and demand side. So HSBC carried out a survey of ASEAN countries in 2021, and it's an interesting survey because it indicates that companies were getting about 50% of pressure on ESG from employees. They were getting an equal amount of pressure sort of from regulators, and they were getting a lot of other pressure because of the need to improve their business returns. And ESG is a factor now in that regard. So it gives you a little bit of a snapshot as to why I said it's supply and demand side factors. So let's turn a little bit to the review of the 6 jurisdictions. Now, in the small report that we produced for you, and hopefully that will get distributed to you later, because unlike my friend Güven, who's going to come with a lovely PowerPoint presentation, I'm only speaking to it. I think what you'll find there is amongst other things, an interesting 2021 survey done by Global Risk Profile on ESG metrics. And how do the countries fare? Well, at one level, very differently. Australia emerges in the top 6. Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia are somewhere in the hundreds, top hundreds. So they are kind of at the medium risk category. And India and Bangladesh are at 139, 142. So they are considered high risk. So at one level, a picture seems to be that countries are very different across these jurisdictions. But the other side of the picture, I think, that emerges is that increasingly, all the jurisdictions are starting to move in a similar direction. We are starting to see some, despite that divergence, some level of convergence. And interestingly, some of the countries which on the global risk profile are at the lower end are the countries that are pushing hardest in terms of codified sort of initiatives, legal and regulatory initiatives to push up ESG performance. So this suggests that the drive towards convergence actually is picking up and accelerating. So let's have a look at a few of those. I won't go through those, through all the factors exhaustively, but if we look at, do the surveyed countries all have laws related to ESGs? All those 6 jurisdictions do have laws related to ESG, and countries like India are stipulating explicitly that duties of directors must extend towards the environment. India also stipulates mandatory corporate social responsibility spending requirements. If we look at Bangladesh, they have requirements on corporate social responsibility spending on climate change for banks and financial institutions. Public or listed companies in Indonesia are required to give a report on CSR. If we look at regulatory measures, again, sort of interesting to see across the board, the regulator is pushing. So in India, the top 1,000 listed companies by market cap are mandatorily required now by the Securities Exchange Board of India to give ESG-related disclosures. And Bangladesh Bank, which is the central bank in Bangladesh, mandates that with regard to banks and financial institutions on a quarterly basis. Now, Australia, through its securities and prudential regulators, the Philippines securities regulator, these are all regulators that are moving in similar directions. So the story, I think, on this is that despite the divergence, some level of convergence, and interestingly, even on issues like taxonomy, national taxonomy, which is important so that the countries have an understanding of what represents ESG, national taxonomies are starting to really develop. Quite a few jurisdictions have it. Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Philippines have it. India is in the process of developing one. So these are ways in which so-called greenwashing, which is ways of misrepresenting that you're actually doing sustainable activity, can get mitigated. So let's move from this review of 6 jurisdictions to a review of the electric vehicles sector. Now, in this sector, there are, at one level, it's a sunrise sector. It's got huge drivers in terms of environmental drivers on reducing carbon emissions, improving air quality. These are major drivers on the E side. And sometimes people think of the rise of the EV industry purely through the E lens. I think that's wrong, and our report suggests that that's not the right way to look at it. The S lens is equally important because consumer mobility, issues of how women, students, elderly people can get better access has become important in the EV industry. Employment opportunities and entrepreneurship opportunities arising out of the EV industry, technology-driven, are also huge. Now, there are a series of global programs that are driving the industry. I mean, there's some GEF programs, many of those involving countries amongst those 6 jurisdictions. There are lending programs, global lending programs, which are also supporting them. But maybe equally importantly, you've got major industry players. So I don't want to necessarily pick out one, but if you had to pick one, Vietnam's VinFast, for example, is moving it at a very rapid pace to become a major export driver for EVs. India and Indonesia will likely become the second largest markets for electric two-wheelers. So it tells you something about that drive. That said, the EV sector also represents a whole series of challenges. And what our survey indicates is that those challenges extend to lack of charging infrastructure, a lack of reliable electricity grids, without dependence on fossil fuels, consumer education and incentives, and importantly, end of life recycling. So in other words, if you're going to fill up hazardous waste landfills because of batteries or unfit vehicles, that's a real issue. And countries are starting to move to ethical waste management, etc. We see this in the Philippines. There is engagement in that space by Australia as well. So what sort of recommendations would we have in the EV sector? We'd want financial incentives, public-private partnership, special economic zones. Maybe we should have a harmonized portal on information. We should look at new forms of technology, solar panels on a floating basis to get around land acquisition issues. There's a lot of work to be done on electric waste and battery recycling, government-mandated quality testing, ways of addressing concerns on range, so-called range anxiety. These are just some of the kind of issues that the EV sector would need in order to move forward. So let's turn quickly to textiles. Textiles, I think, a hugely important sector. Why did we choose textiles alongside EV? We wanted to choose a green sector, and we wanted to choose a sector that was important in the S sense, right? And if you look at textiles, the volume of clothing is moving from 62 million tons in 2015 to a projected 102 million tons by 2030. Each of the countries has major exposures in this area. Philippines is moving through a 10-year BOI plan. Bangladesh, through its 2018 Textiles Act, it's already a major hub for textiles. India is trying to move its share of global trade. It's at about 4% right now, 11% of its overall exports. Vietnam is fast growing from 1.5% to 2.5% of exports. So these are all major trends. In Australia, of course, a major importer as well. Now, all of this sounds great, but there are significant challenges. It's seen as a polluting sector because of the disposal of garments, and the minimum labor standards are often a serious issue. So just to give you one example, a firm in Leicester in the UK was found to be a sweatshop exporting to a company called Boohoo. Boohoo's share price collapsed by 40% when that news came out. So the sector is rife with challenges, and there need to therefore be a whole set of recommendations which we've suggested on responsible supply chains, particularly for small and medium enterprises who are part of that supply chain and need to reach those kinds of standards expected by consumer behavior, expected increasingly by trade agreements. There need to be fiscal measures which help support a circular economy and sustainable productivity. And if I had to pick one example, Sweden is interesting. They've actually given a VAT reduction from 25 to 12% on repair of consumer goods. So this is part of the drive on recycling, right? So that's that on textiles. The last point I want to make is on CACCI. And, I spoke about the global drivers at the beginning and what's happening domestically. Now, maybe this is slightly controversial, but if I was to think about COP27, a local newspaper report called it a mirage in the desert, right? Global initiatives are really struggling on issues like climate change. At the same time, whilst there is some domestic convergence happening, it's not complete. So CACCI can meet that missing middle by accelerating the regional convergence, because the battle on ESG will be won or lost in the Asia Pacific. And how can it do that? It can do that by promoting best practices. It can do that by providing opportunity for learning between businesses. It can do that by supporting some kind of permanent research secretariat. With that, I think my boring voice should end, and the more interesting voice of my good friend Güven should begin. Thanks very much.
Very insightful, from all the way from the climate change, which in fact sparked all of this transition into looking at from an ESG point of view towards social responsibility, and driving towards regulatory push, and not only by putting in hard regulations or in fact in the commerce regulation as well, and also putting incentives into it. That's very interesting, and really appreciate, and from the CACCI side as well, collaboratively we can look at achieving the goals that we want to achieve. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Güven on presenting in paper on how to adjust to the green digital transformation. This is something very exciting, a premiere for CACCI. Professor Dr. Güven is economic policy researcher at Turkey, so TEPAV. Over to you, Dr. Güven.
Thank you. What I'm going to talk about is very much complementary to my colleague Arjun Goswani's presentation, in fact. But I tend to disagree on one point. Although there were discussions about COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh as being a mirage in the desert, I think it is related with the agenda of the existing agenda of COP27. But the green digital transformation is already here. Just yesterday, the European Parliament, that's the Parliament of the European Union, has agreed on the law regarding carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is going to influence all of us. It's kind of taking these measures, I mean, these parameters as important in terms of putting a kind of an additional burden on the imports of the European Union countries, in fact. So I think the thing is already here. Next slide, please. That I mean, this transformation process is already here. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about this Green New Deal. It's kind of the new transformation project, the new moonshot project for the technological transformation on both that's taking shape. It's kind of a production zone that's taking shape on both sides of the Atlantic. It's not related to Pacific per se, but it's already taking place, and it means a lot, not only for the CACCI countries, but for the whole world. It's going to bring a kind of a global value chain realignment with it. And that's where I think we need to focus on and think about how CACCI countries or the chamber federations could react to this Green New Deal that's taking shape. I have three issues here that I'm going to underline while I'm discussing. One is about this, you know, there are so many discussions about reshoring of global value chains, which were very important in the past in shaping the industrial policies of the region. And then the second issue is about just transition. That's both global and also domestic in terms of, you know, because there are going to be countries, people, regions that are going to gain from this transition, and there are going to be countries, regions, people who are going to lose in this transition period. And I tend to think that G20 is a good conduit for this discussion on climate policy governments from now on. Next slide, please. But let me say a few words about TEPAV. You know, we are working closely. We were in fact established by the generous support of the Chamber Federation of Turkey. And we are a think and do tank in Ankara, focusing on economic policies, basically. Next slide, please. We can pass these. Next slide. Okay. I tend to think that, you know, in discussing the ESG framework too, I think this is kind of a, I mean, when I look at the ESG discussions and the shape it's taking with the Green Deal discussions in the EU and Green New Deal discussions in the United States, I think we are about to enter maybe a third phase of globalization. The first one is about goods passing borders. You know, that was the period for trade follows the flag. The old, you know, before the First World War, maybe we can identify the period as being the period of goods passing borders. Then we entered a second phase after the Second War. It's about factories passing through borders, and there trade follows investments. That's how many of our countries become part of global value chains, and that's how our trade has started to increase. How the shape of global trade has started to change. And I think now we are about to enter a third phase where global value chains realigning with green and digital transformation. And there, I think the important issue, the basic parameter is that trade is to follow the climate policy issues. So then this is going to bring a total realignment of supply chains all around the world. It's about changes in both the software, I mean the rules and regulations, the hardware, ports, etc., everything, railways, etc., and also security cooperation networks, I think. So it's going to be a kind of a change that's going to overhaul what we have been doing in the last 3 or 4 decades. Next slide, please. And that was very useful for us, for our type of countries. This is sharing global manufacturing exports from 1960s to 2020. And as you see, the sharing global manufacturing exports of G20, G7, EU 27 has declined, but that of CACCI countries has increased. I also put China over there, if you look at the left-hand side. But on the right-hand side, you can see South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, Vietnam, and these are the countries that has gained from this shift. That was the shift in the second phase, where factories pass through borders, global value chains have been established, in fact. Next slide, please. And this is also, if you look at South Asia, East Asia, especially Southeast Asia, that's where the high-tech, global value chain formation has been seen, in fact. The high technology part is changing from Australasia to Central Asia, as you can see, but the higher that component is, the high-tech component is, the stronger the global value chain participation in that. Next slide, please. And as I told you, this is a new trading zone, production zone that's taking shape on both sides of the Atlantic. And this slide just shows the share of global imports. And as I have noted, the imports are here important. These are the major markets in terms of our products. When you look at the EU 27, it's around 30%, the share of the EU 27 in global imports. UK is already there, and you can also, the blue one is the CACCI's share in the countries, in that places, imports. USA has a share of around 12% in the global imports, and China's share is about 8.8%, 9%. And if you look at other places, their market share, I mean, the share as a buyer of products from our countries too, is not that big. So when G7 has decided to follow this green and digital transformation and decided to form a kind of a new trading zone, that means today around 52% of the global imports. So it's a major market, and it's the richest market when you look at especially the EU 27. Next slide, please. So when that market has decided to change its rules and regulations, then we need to adjust. And when it comes to Turkey, for example, around 60% of our exports are going to G7 countries. And when it comes to the EU, it's around 50% of our exports. So as it's a major market for a country like Turkey, when they decide to place a carbon border adjustment mechanism, adding a fee on all our imports that do not comply with climate regulations or with climate regulations, then there is the need for a country like Turkey to adjust to the new situation. So what we have learned so far regarding this change, I'm only going to point out that in that slide, this transition cannot happen overnight. That's the good side of the transition process. There is the need for a transition management process, and there is room for discussion regarding climate policy governance and if in G20 or at UN, and if we don't have for our type of countries to enter the discussions, then we need to create a mechanism, a new mechanism for policy discussions. What is important here, I think, is this is a period where reshoring is going to take place. And there is also the issue of, our type of countries to think smartly in entering into discussions regarding this, green transition, green digital transition, in terms of raising our issues, I think. And that's what COP27 has been trying to do, and that's where the thing has failed, in fact. So next slide, please. We can pass this, but I only would like to raise among the global risks, I only would like to raise the issue of war in Ukraine. As I have noted, there are countries that are going to gain out of this transformation, and there are countries that are going to lose. And mainly, hydrocarbon producers are going to lose in this transition process. Not now, let's say in 10 years from now, 30 years from now, they are definitely going to lose. And I think Russia is going to be the biggest loser in this whole process, in this whole transformation process. And that's how we look at the war in Ukraine and the current supply chain disruptions, I think. Next slide, please. But this decarbonization agenda is going to stay with us anyway. When it comes to carbon border adjustment mechanism, I think what EU has been trying to do, they are trying to export their emission trading system to us. Otherwise, we are going to pay, our companies are going to pay additional taxes to the European Union. But if we all have emission trading systems, ETSs, that means if we have carbon pricing mechanisms in our type of countries, then we don't have to pay those dues to the EU, but we need to keep it in our treasuries. So I think that's the major way, this one way that this new framework is imposed on all of us. And I think it's not going to stop here. Now the EU has been working on a legislation for product standards, and those standards include the ECG framework, and also it includes the climate policy prerogatives, starting from carbon footprint, water footprint, and also waste management practices. Next slide, please. But the CACCI countries has been taking steps, and these are the, these are the net zero commitments of CACCI countries that they have already decided. Is 2053 for Turkey, 2050 for Australia, 2070 for India. But there are countries with no pledges, and that's the dark gray ones are the countries with no pledges at the moment regarding the net zero commitment. So net zero commitments means that there is a policy framework in those type of countries. There is a policy discussion at least in those CACCI countries, but not in some of them, of course. Next slide, please. And when you look at carbon-based growth history, you can see that there is a decoupling of carbon emissions and economic growth in the EU countries. While the growth is increasing, the carbon emissions tend to decline since the beginning of this century. This process has been continuing. But if you look at the East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, there is no decoupling, and that's where there is the need for action to achieve that decoupling, and that decoupling has been achieved in the EU through the change in production processes, the change in technologies, and the change in the energy distribution, energy networks, energy production and distribution networks. Next slide, please. so when it's about the digital readiness for digital transformation, again, there is high disparity among CACCI countries. This is the Future Readiness Economic Index scores of the CACCI countries. Next slide, please. So, but this time, so we have a climate crisis. We have, how can I say that? We have transnational threats this time that needs to be taken into account. It is a different crisis. Transnational threats like climate change, pandemic, cannot be solved within one country. There is the need for cooperation. But this crisis is different from the past crises of our countries, like the Southeast Asian financial and economic crisis, for example. In the previous crisis, when we have a crisis, countries just bounce back. So we just go back to where we were at the outset. But this time, it is about bouncing forward to an uncertain future. And when it comes to bouncing forward, capabilities of countries, regions, firms, individuals differ. This is the same for CACCI, this is the same for Turkey, and in many other countries around the world. And this brings in political polarization and resentment as a result, which is, again, another transnational threat that needs to be taken into account globally. So it is all about how to manage the transformation process. You can see that you can see the importance of managing properly the transformation process in the energy discussions in Europe nowadays. But I think more is to be expected from CACCI countries, and policy-making capacity in our type of countries, in both private sector and public sector, needs to be enhanced in this new environment. Next slide, please. So this is a kind of the agenda for kind of in these troubled times. I can see that in the development of the UNDP reports too, but you can read it later. I can send this to you. So next slide, please. Let me try to close the argument as quickly as possible. So when I look at the issue of green digital transformation, it looks very good for the West, but it is not that good. It requires capacity development in the rest, because this is a capital-intensive transformation process, and there is the need for increasing the capabilities of different countries, especially when there is diversity. Next slide, please. Berat? Next slide.
Yes.
So
This
this
was
is
the
where
final one for this version, Hocam.
Okay, so the important issue then, let me say it here, it is important for CACCI to look for example, G20 as a venue for policy discussions, for climate policy discussions, and focus on starting a dialogue about how our type of countries are going to adjust, how our private sectors are going to adjust, because there is the need for funding. And that's the discussion in Sharm el-Sheikh, basically. It's about damage and loss due to climate change, and damage and loss due to policies to fight against climate change also. And that's the green transformation, because this transformation is not about job creation at the outset. It's going to, more a capital-intensive transformation process, and it is costly for countries that are highly indebted, basically. So let me stop here. But I see let me underline the complementarity. Arjun Goswani has noted.
Thank you, Dr. Güven. That is insightful, and one of the interesting aspect is the digital aspect, right? So the green digital transformation is something that is, I'm sure, going to accelerate the adoption of the green and the ESG as well. Mr. Arjun, this relates directly to you. What is the significance of the countries chosen in the ESG study? I know you answered briefly, but I would like to open the floor.
I think it's a completely legitimate question. By the way, a great presentation from Güven. I mean, covering the sweep of what's happening globally. So the reason we chose these 6 countries was, first of all, to have a mix of developing countries, not just taken from one part of Asia. So we tried to have a mix between South Asian and Southeast Asian countries, and not necessarily have developing countries that were all at the same level right now on ESG. But we wanted to have at least one developed country economy as well in the mix. So that was one reason. The second reason was that when we looked at this group of developing countries, many of them have a desire to become big manufacturing hubs, both for textiles and for electric vehicles. Australia plays a different role in that process. They've moved away from issues, for example, of production of vehicles, but they are interested in imports, and they have a significant role to play in the minerals sector in terms of providing inputs, for example, into the EV sector. And because of their concerns on product stewardship, etc., also can, work towards the global standard setting that the textile sector needs. So we thought this would provide for a good mix of countries to buttress the conclusions and the recommendations of the report.
Thank you, Mr. Arjun. So to expand to that, the interrelated question, I would think so, is, based on the countries, but the next question is, do you plan to expand the ESG study to perhaps cover the other industries? How would you prioritize that also, right?
It's a very difficult question. I mean, I'll be honest with you, we definitely face data challenges, and maybe partly also some language limitations as we were working across these countries. So even in these sectors, to the extent that we can get more information, I think that would be a valuable start. And I think rather than spread across too many sectors, if we can develop sort of some depth in these and move these sectors forward using CACCI, that could be useful. Once that happens, there's, of course, there are lots of other sectors that one would want to look at certainly in the E pillar. In the E pillar, for sure, the energy sector is closely intertwined with the transport sector. So in a way, if we were to expand further forward, that would be a logical sector to go through. And there's tremendous technological transformation taking place. I mean, today we're talking about electric vehicles. There is a school of thought which says hydrogen fuel cell will be the wave of the future, right? So we need to do study again across jurisdictions to see what the relative scope will be of these different technologies. Let me just stop there.
Thanks, Mr. Arjun. I think it is a tough question to answer right now, and you put it on pretty well. So, but just given that, before I go to Dr. Güven, there's one more question that has come up, right? Could you please discuss the sustainability issues which should be mandatory for compliance for textile industries in Bangladesh, textile industries in Bangladesh, and what are the advantages of such transformation? But I'd like to add to that also, right, where Mr. Mustafa has asked this question is, you did, while presenting, talk about national taxonomy.
That's
right?
right.
And regulation being part of it. So if you can connect those, and you also mentioned that Bangladesh has implemented national taxonomy around it, right? Yeah. So over to you. Mr.
So, nice question on Bangladesh from Mustafa, and I understand it. Let me start with one element, which is that in some ways, you know, I think it's fair to say that Bangladesh has been a sort of poster child of the growth of sustainable textile industry. I mean, they've, you know, I often think back to the words of a man who we should discard as somebody who maybe in statecraft had many good things to say, but he was completely wrong about Bangladesh. And that was Henry Kissinger. If you recall, in 1970, 71, he said, this country is a basket case. Well, Bangladesh has proved him totally wrong, right? That's the first point. And one of the reasons that they've succeeded is because they've managed to have an employment push through textiles, and they understood early on that it needs to go on a sustainable path. So, you know, the reason I referred to the Textiles Act, which they have, the 2018 Textiles Act, is that they have worked on incentives to try and bring, you know, foreign investment in. They've thought about one-stop service centers for quick delivery of services for textile-related projects. And you can't really make progress on having sustainable exports which meet that global consumer expectation unless you are doing all those things domestically. And the labeling which Bangladesh has gone through has also helped, because there has been some credibility to that labeling. Now, has it all been smooth sailing for Bangladesh? Absolutely not. So, you know, the Rana Plaza collapse of 2013 was a wake-up call, and Bangladesh took it very seriously and pushed forward its labor conditions. And by doing that, it was able to really penetrate the global market. So it's not just taxonomy, it's not just the incentive system, it's also understanding what the global standards are. So, you know, I have, maybe my early comments were a little politically incorrect, but that's okay. That's part of the beauty of being able to speak to CACCI. Over to you.
Thanks, Mr. Arjun. This was very insightful as well. So I would like to go to Dr. Güven now. And given this, we did discuss about Green New Deal, and on that, you know, how to encompass that into a global value chain. So, you know, if you look at that, I'm sure digital will accelerate that, but how? And do you see that global adoption happening sooner than later?
It's going. Let me go over where Arjun has left. You know, because this is about sectoral transformation at the end of the day. When you are talking about global value chains changing their shapes, it's about sectoral change. So when it comes to, for example, you know, yesterday's decision in European Parliament, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that includes for us, for Turkey now, and for all of us, iron and steel, aluminium, cement, you know, mainly energy intensive industries. There is going to be an additional tax on all the imports that are polluting the environment, that has the larger carbon footprint. So if you are not taxing, if you don't have any carbon pricing in your country, then you need to pay the total amount that European companies are already paying to their governments in terms of carbon prices in all these sectors. And this is not only in all these sectors, they now also have added hydrogen there, gray hydrogen. Green hydrogen is not included, but gray hydrogen is included. So if you are producing your hydrogen with renewable energy, that's good. There is no carbon price for that. But if you are producing your hydrogen through, let's say, through coal coal firing plants, etc., then you need to pay something. And it doesn't end here, because, for example, iron and steel is used in white goods, in automobiles, and also in the textile industry too. You know, you use energy, for example. If the energy that you are using includes more of hydrocarbons, then you need to pay something. You need to pay, if you don't have a carbon price in your own country, then you need to pay this to the European Union at the end of the day. So this is an additional tax that they are putting, and it is not against the WTO arrangements. It is becoming part of those arrangements now. So I think when you look at the green and digital transformation from this angle, first of all, the green part includes, we are going to have a new accounting system that in producing everything, we need to now, from now on, and also in the services sector too, we need to look at the carbon footprint, we need to look at the water footprint, and we need to look at the waste management process. If you are not doing these things properly, if there is no taxes, carbon taxes or carbon pricing on these activities, then you need to pay an additional amount to the EU when you are selling goods to the European markets. Not only to the European markets, to the US, wait for the US markets and the whole G7 countries. And this is going to happen, I think, very soon. It looks highly likely that this thing is going to happen very soon. Regarding digital transformation, I think the whole backbone of trade is changing now. So it's becoming more digital. The order collection systems, you know, the payment mechanisms, etc. So you need to become part of that digital transformation as quickly as possible. This we see in Turkey, for example. Turkey is part of the customs union. We have a customs union with the European Union now, and we had that arrangement in 1996. Now it doesn't have any meaning. Our customs union arrangement doesn't have any meaning. We need to make the complete digital transformation as quickly as possible. And we need to, because it is now not the single market in the EU, it's the digital single market now in the EU. There are rules and regulations regarding that. And also there is this Green Deal and Green Deal arrangements that are making our customs union arrangements with the EU totally, wholly obsolete. So that's why, for example, we are discussing in Turkey about customs union modernization, which is very important. Our partners are discussing about that too. And that is about modernization now, is about adopting a decarbonization agenda as quickly as possible. So it is not, you know, it's not in some future period. Yesterday's arrangement in the EU is going to become operational in 2026. So we have only a small period of time trying to adjust. And this whole mechanism, this is kind of, you know, making ESG compulsory for all the countries in order to trade with the EU. Because with the product standards that are now taking shape in the EU, there are also labor standards that are coming. All the social inclusion type of things are also coming in. So I think there is the need to be ready. And for our type of countries, I mean, this is important for Japan too, but Japan is already part of it when you look at the CACCI countries. But for other CACCI countries, we need to be ready to start a discussion, a policy discussion with all our partners about how to adjust. Because as I have noted, it is not possible, not all the countries have the same capabilities to adjust in this arrangement that is taking shape. So that's why, you know, we need to start thinking about how we are going to adjust, and we need to, as Arjun has started the discussion, we need to do it sector by sector, not only the industries, but also services sector is already included. I mean, all the companies that are part of global value chains are already receiving letters, you know, in the last 1.5 to 2 years from their partners whom they are part of their supply chains. They are all asking questions. Even, you know, the maritime companies are receiving the letters. What is your carbon footprint? What is your water footprint? What are you doing for waste management? So these are the questions, and all the financing from now on is going to be based on those things. These are the parameters, these are the priorities. It is not possible, for example, from the IFIs and also from the commercial banks to receive from now on any funding for thermal plants, for example. That's why China has also decided that they are not going to build any coal-fired plants, electricity plants outside China. That's everybody's trying to comply with this new situation, and I think it's going to be faster than we envisaged, as far as I see now.
Thank you, Dr. Güven. Just the last one, adding to that, on your presentation also you presented about decarbonization. The adoption in European country is faster and quicker, and as you presented that in Asia it's slower in adoption of decarbonization. So, what is your observation on that? Why is that so?
Oh, it is all related, when it comes to carbon emissions, that decarbonization is related to carbon emissions. There are process 1 and process 2 emissions. There are emissions, carbon emissions that are related with the energy production network. If it is too much based on hydrocarbons, your energy production depends on too much on hydrocarbons, then that decoupling has not happened in those countries yet. In Turkey, it has started after 2018. I forgot to show you. I took that slide out, but you can see that it started to decouple, but it wasn't like the case in the EU. And in the US too, it is possible to see the same decoupling, no matter what. And with the recent announcements of the Biden administration, that decoupling is going to continue more rapidly. So one very important issue is how you are producing your energy. And the second is process emissions. Process emissions means, how you are producing things in your, which technology, which machines you are using. So the world already has the new technologies, has started to develop those technologies, as noted in the EU case, the decoupling in the EU and US cases. So now we need to change our production processes accordingly. We need to change the materials that we are using in the production processes. And that requires, it is also part of the new products too, like electric vehicles. And that requires, I think, in all our countries, our supply chain security concerns are also changing, because we are going to buy our imports from different places now. So I think there is going to be a total realignment, and that's why, all our type of countries and business support organizations has to be ready to advocate, to increase this policy advocacy process for their members. I think it's a very important transition period. We are at the outset, we are still at the outset, we still have time. So I think it is ample time, we have ample time to focus on how we are going to prepare our policy positions and start policy advocacy efforts, and in the venues that we are going to use. And it is good that G20 was in Indonesia last year, now it is in India. This year, now it is in India. So I think it is ample time now for us to say something. And India is good when it comes to, starting a discussion on climate policy governments. With Arjun, we can do that maybe.
We should. I have to say, Mangesh, is, listening to Güven is such a delight, because we are absolutely joined together in terms of how we see this. And the trade and investment sort of map he's described is actually crucial for the sectoral transformation that I was talking about. So that's true. And on taxonomy, there's one thing I ought to say. This refers back to the earlier question. It's fine for countries to develop national taxonomy, but somewhere there has to be a reference point back to where the global taxonomy is. Otherwise, we will end up with huge divergences. And CACCI's role should be to try and help that process along, right? It's not, depending purely on TCFD and these global bodies to do that. It's too big a task. We've already seen how hard it is. So I would say that kind of engagement could be hugely valuable. And using the G20 presidency, moving from Indonesia to India, to kind of keep pushing forward would be great. And I think CACCI have a great role to play for next year.
Thanks, Dr. Güven. Thanks, Arjun. I think that's very insightful. This ESG and more sustainable future for today and for tomorrow, not only for industry but for the humankind and the planet, is very important as well. And as you mentioned, CACCI has a focus out there for sure around taking it forward with all the member countries. And we at YEGAP, I serve as a chair for the Young Entrepreneurs Group of Asia Pacific as well. So, and we at YEGAP also, where Rishabh is leading this particular effort on integrating this with CACCI and the member countries as well. So, but definitely we look forward on more collaboration and taking this forward with the CACCI countries and integrating this into our with our fellow members as well. So with that further ado, thank you so much. This was very insightful. A lot of this is very new but pressing topics at the moment. So we thank you for your time and the intelligence that you've provided today, and look forward on working together.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Take care. All the best.
Everyone.
Bye, everybody. Bye.